climate change is not the problem. Climate change is a symptom of a much larger dysfunction, and we will have to change the economic system, not just the energy system.
Welcome to the Green Urbanist, podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Hello, welcome back to the Green Urbanist podcast for another episode. I'm Ross. If you are new here, this podcast is all about how cities and urbanists can respond to the climate and biodiversity crises and cover a wide range of topics related to that. I'm delighted today to welcome a guest speaker, which is Nate Hagens on the podcast. Nate is a systems thinker and educator focused on a concept he calls the Great Simplification. He spent the last 20 years studying the systems we live in, like the energy system, ecology, and economics. He teaches at the University of Minnesota and speaks widely on these topics, including on his YouTube channel, which is called Nate Hagens, and his podcast called The Great Simplification. In this episode, we discuss what is the Great Simplification, what that means for cities, some ideas for that, what the end of fossil fuels means for the world, something we'll have to come to terms with in the coming decades, the importance of scenario planning for the future of cities, why electric vehicles and renewables alone are not the answer to climate change, and why a post-growth economy is inevitable in the coming decades. We go on to discuss some ideas for what post-growth cities might look like, how we'll have to change how we plan and manage cities in a post-growth reality. And in fact, I'd like to follow up with another episode in the future with more ideas inspired by this conversation with Nate. Now, Nate is extremely honest and clear about the direction he sees the world going. Some of you listening will likely disagree with his conclusions, may even feel defensive about them. And that's absolutely fine. Of course, we're all free to disagree with each other. But I'd urge you to keep an open mind and consider seriously what he says and follow up with the resources in the episode description to learn more about how he's come to these conclusions. All right, thank you so much for listening and enjoy this episode. Welcome, Nate, to the Green Urbanist podcast. It's really good to have you.
Great to be here, Ross.
Can you please just get straight into it and tell us a bit about, or sort of summary of your idea of the Great Simplification? What is that?
Right. So my 20 years of research in energy and systems has led me to a conclusion that human cultures and institutions and the stories that we tell ourselves now are what I refer to as energy blind. We don't recognize that everything we do in the modern economy requires energy to invent and create and mine and deliver and repair and dispose of. There's energy everywhere. But since we're pulling out ancient carbon that was refined and heated and turned into this incredibly powerful substance 10 million times faster than it was geologically sequestered by the trickle charge of historical daily photosynthesis. All we do is we value the cost that it takes us to extract coal, oil, and natural gas, not the value it provides for us. So over centuries and in a moonshot trajectory of late, humans solve problems by adding complexity. And when we add complexity, we require energy and all the different additional nodes and connections in a local, national, global economy. And so what I refer to as the Great Simplification, I think will be one of the most momentous events in human history, because for the first time in hundreds of years, the amount of this energy available to us will, instead of be increasing, it will be decreasing. And that has massive implications for all of our plans, all of our governance, our institutions, et cetera. And this is a big story to unpack, but when I refer to the Great Simplification, It is the inverse of the great complexification that has
Mm.
unfolded over the last, especially over the last 150 years, as we've been awash in this sea of cheap and abundant fossil energy.
So can you paint a bit more of a picture for us? I guess what you mean by simplification and what that might mean.
Yeah, so um, we don't think about it, but a barrel of oil has around 4 years of yours or mine physical work embodied in it, and how much labor potential it has. It has 1,700 kilowatt hours worth of work, and you and I could do zero point 0.6 kilowatt hours in one day. So the world uses 100 billion barrel of oil equivalents of coal oil and natural gas every year, which works out to around 4 to 500 billion human worker equivalents that we have running machines all over the world. You're in the UK. I don't know the statistics there, but in the United States, the average American household has 40 devices plugged in at all times, drawing down little bits of electricity that were created by mostly coal and natural gas. Um, so a simplification would be, as prices for energy go up, and we could get into why prices might go up and why there would be less energy available. But what ends up happening is our entire industrial processes are based on adding thousands of units of fossil energy at an incredibly cheap price to replace human energy that we used to do with our muscles or with draft animals. And so that dynamic is very sensitive to price increases or cost increases in energy. Look at what happened in the UK last winter. Uh, there was less natural gas, and the government had to subsidize heating. Also, what happened in Europe, there were many chemical manufacturing plants in Germany and elsewhere that had to go out of business because the natural gas prices were very, very high, at least for a while. And so, not only do we use a lot of energy in our current infrastructure setup, but we use the way we use it is almost as if it's not that important, that a liter of petrol is about the price of a liter of milk or orange juice or something. And yet, what it provides for us is orders of magnitude more important. So, a great simplification means that society is going to have to take a pay cut, which means the average member of society is going to have to take a pay cut. And the simplification not only applies to our personal annual budgets, but to the globally connected infrastructure of just in time, complex, six continent supply chains for
Mm.
all the different components of our things. And the reason that that happened, number one, oil was the hemoglobin of the global transportation chain. So we became a global economy over the last 50 years. And two, because of that, countries specialized in the things that they were best at. So I think there's a lot of huge flaws in macroeconomic theory. But one thing that they kind of got right is the theory of comparative advantage, is if a country can make semiconductors and toilet paper better than another country at both things, the world is better off if one country focuses everything on semiconductors and the other country focuses all their resources on toilet paper. And the world then has more semiconductors and more toilet paper at a cheaper price. And imagine that little anecdote times thousands of things. And so we have different countries that have stopped making any medicines at all. They buy all their medicines from India and China because they specialize on something else. What does the UK specialize on? Finance. which isn't that sustainable. So I actually think Ireland is way further down the road on sustainable practices on some of these things. So a simplification there means we're going to, sooner rather than later, have to become more reliant on local and regional supply chains. Like maybe the UK does a lot of things with Europe instead of Indonesia or New Zealand, because those supply chains will become more expensive and we'll have to make do with things more locally. So that's one another aspect of what I mean the simplification. Of course, there's larger things too. Like what does it mean? I mean, all of our institutions are based on the assumption that economic growth of 2 to 3% will continue indefinitely into the future. There is no government body or major corporation or institution that is operating on anything other than that assumption. And if all of a sudden we have flat growth, or heaven forbid, negative growth, that people aren't prepared for that. And
Mm.
our prior financial claims, where when we've had economic problems in the past, instead of recognizing them and having austerity, we printed more money or created more debt. And so when you issue debt, that debt will eventually have to be paid back with things that require energy and materials. And so, as the world accesses the next lower tranche of fossil hydrocarbons that are more costly, more diffuse, harder to get out, more distant and remote, dirtier, those things mean that the next wave of hydrocarbons is going to be more costly. And if it's more costly, it's going to mean less benefits, globally. And of course, these fossil hydrocarbons are not evenly distributed. The United States is largely energy independent. But if we look at the amount of oil, and oil is particularly valuable because it's liquid at room temperature, it's transportable. It's incredibly energy dense. It can be transported on pipelines or on ships. Um, if you look at how much oil is available for purchase in the open market, 50% of that is produced in Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq.
Wow.
That's 50% of the world's buyable oil. Now, the United States doesn't export any oil. We produce a lot, but we consume it all. And in terms of the UK used to produce a lot of oil in the North Sea, but they're 20 some years past the peak in their production, and there's very little oil left in the UK. So this to me is the dawn of a new way of viewing our reality. Our reality has always been this, but we haven't recognized it as such. And I call it a biophysical phase shift, which is a switch from thinking about the human enterprise in terms of money and technology. And we're moving into an era where we think of it and recognize as true it's energy, materials, and ecosystems, the viability and support of the land and nature, and the non-renewable resources of energy and materials. Those are going to become much more prominent in our local and national discussions.
Do you, so you've coined this term, the carbon pulse, which is something I really like, which is, this we know that fossil fuels are non-renewable, but this sort of one-time injection of energy into the world is coming to an end. We're possibly coming down the downslope of that massive curve. Do you have a sense of what the sort of time scale of this is?
Yeah. So fossil fuels, and really they're not fuels. We've just called them fuels. They're really fossil carbon and hydrocarbons. They are renewable, just not on human timescales. It takes
Yes.
millions of years to renew them because oil is ancient phytoplankton and diatoms in the oceans and seas that died and went to the bottom of the ocean and was compressed, and over geologic time turned into this energy liquid substance. Um, so there's plenty of oil available. From a climate and ocean perspective, one could successfully argue there's too much oil available. But the issue isn't the number of oil molecules in the ground. The issue is the cost of extraction and the flow rate. So what's happened in the United States is we peaked in oil production in 1971 and had 40 years of declining oil production. But then we found the technology of shale oil, and then we pierced that 1971 peak. And what we really did, though, is that oil was always there. We just had a larger straw to be able to suck it out. And it depletes really quickly, this shale oil, up to 80% in the first 18 months. So we're that much closer to the slurping sound at the bottom of a drink when you have a straw, and we have to drill faster and faster to get at what's left. There is a lot left. The Permian Basin in the United States is massive, and without the Permian, the world would already be in permanent decline. In fact, 2018 so far has been the maximum in global oil production. We've yet to pierce that level. There's a geological limit to how much oil we can extract, and that is the best case. That's like all the oil fields in the world right now that exist are declining their production at around 6% a year if you add them all up. So we have to drill new oil wells to offset that 6% or maybe even grow the total. But it's an issue of the size of the straw. And there's all sorts of forecasts out there. But I would say middle of the envelope guess that by 2050, 27 years from now, we'll be roughly at 50 to 60% of today's amount of oil. Not a disaster, still incredibly powerful for what it does for us. Probably too much for climate scenarios, but it's going to change everything about our infrastructure, our organization, et cetera. That's what I say best case, because there are financial, geopolitical complexity risks that you have to overlay on top of that.
So when we, see politicians giving the green light for new oil and gas, they're not really adding to the capacity. We're just sort of standing still. Is that what you're saying?
There's two ways to look at that, Ross. One is, and my work has focused on this, that humans en masse are acting as an energy dissipating structure. We have outsourced our decision making to the financial markets. In the financial markets, when money is created, the interest is not created. And so there's this imperative to grow. And so this entire global economic machine requires growth. That growth requires energy. Energy and GDP globally are 99% correlated. So if we want to grow, we need high quality energy and affordable energy. And so it's a paradox that many of the progressive leaders of the world, in my country, in your country, in the UK, care about climate change. On the one hand, they voice concerns. We need to go low carbon and have a renewable transition. Yeah. But on the other hand, they need to keep the economy going. And so they approve new oil and gas leases and enable drilling in Alaska and such. So on the one hand, it's kind of inevitable that we're going to extract every affordable molecule that we can. So I wouldn't say that it's standing still. The UK is still going to need that oil. But from a global perspective, if every country tried their hardest to get more oil, we're at a point when the real elephants of the oil fields are already 50, 60 years behind.
Mm.
At some point, and I would argue that point is now, no matter what we do, we can't expand the amount of global oil at one time. That doesn't mean that we're going to have a precipitous drop. But here's the thing, though: it's not. It's the relationship between our financial claims on reality and oil and energy's ability to continue growth that might be what upsets the apple cart, because we have 300 to 400% financial claims around the world in the developed economies on GDP. We keep borrowing in order to consume more today. Um, and once oil starts to decline, even if it declines 10%, we have plenty to maintain a global economy, but not at the size and scale that the financial claims depend on. So then we have to deal with a financial crisis.
Mm.
And that is a big part of my work, is when that moment happens, how can humans in their jobs, in their communities, in their own lives meet the future halfway and prepare for what to do in a smaller, less complex situation.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, because I think many people listening to my podcast would probably think, well, we want oil and gas to decline faster than that. We want it to be net zero by 2050. That's the sort of the
Mm-hmm.
slogan of the sort of environmental movement now. Why? I know you've done some work on sort of why that is probably an impossibility at this point. But I guess the other obvious question is just like, well, why aren't we just replacing oil and gas with renewable energy?
Yeah, well, this is a long conversation. I am an environmentalist. I left Wall Street because I deeply cared about the oceans and climate change, and I now still think that propelling biodiversity through the bottlenecks of the 21st century is the single most important thing that I care
Mm.
about and am working on. That requires a systems view. Yes, climate change and ocean acidification and other ocean risks are paramount, but also plastics, the risk of nuclear war, which would make climate change a walk in the park, and the geopolitical situation, and the complexity, and the social contract. All these things have to be integrated.
Mm.
So there's that. The other issue is that most of the renewable technology produces electricity. Electricity is only around 20% of global energy use. There are things that we can, with ease and some with difficulty, change to electric. And there are some things that would be massive, massive costs to change, like air travel, or bunker fuel heavy ships that transport things around the oceans. So it's not a plug and play.
Yeah.
But the other issue is that all of the technological plans for the future, the techno optimist plans, are built on a premise in the same way that a fish doesn't know it swims in water. These projections happen without realizing that, with the exception of 2020, which was COVID, with the exception of 2009, the great financial crisis, the exception of a couple years in the 1970s, which was the energy crisis, with the exception of the two world wars and a Great Depression in the 1930s, every single year, the last 150 years, we have had more energy available to the world economy than the year before. And so that is something that's just implied in
Mm.
all of that coal, oil, natural gas infrastructure and steel and cement and ammonia and plastic and fertilizer plants are based on this gargantuan 500 billion human labor equivalent army of fossil inputs that suddenly is going to be declining. So I am very pro renewable. I think the ultimate path would be merging our solar, geothermal, wind with declining amounts of fossil fuels. But that will happen in a post growth economy. And that's what we're not preparing for. And I
Mm.
think net zero emissions is absolutely delusional. this entire economy is carbon based. And even if we were to swap out, well, we are growing renewable energy faster than we're growing fossil energy. And yet emissions have hit all-time highs this year. This year, we've hit all-time highs of coal production in the world. We're blowing through all-time highs of coal production. So adding more renewables is just adding the total scale of energy use by humans. So for those of your listeners that climate change is their number one focus, climate change is not the problem. Climate change is a symptom of a much larger dysfunction, and we will have to change the economic system, not just the energy system. Because if we just try to plug and play this bad energy instead of this good energy instead of the bad energy, we're still going to consume more as long as GDP and money are our objectives.
Yeah, so it comes down to economics in the end, and I know you've had Kate Rayworth on your podcast as well. Donut economics. There's also movements around degrowth and things like that. So do you feel a sense of hope around the narrative shifting in economics?
Well, Ross, we just met, and I know nothing really about your listeners, your podcasts, and the cross that I bear is I'm trying to be honest and truthful rather than give people the answers that they want, because there is a trade-off between being accurate and being helpful. And so far in my work, I've erred on being accurate. I think two things. First of all, degrowth is what we should do. It makes sense. It's more equitable. It's logical given our situation, but it's not going to happen. The momentum of the superorganism is too strong. We will eventually hit a wall when we don't have enough cheap energy to continue growth. And then there will be kind of a great simplification, and then we're going to have to respond. Degrowth is what we should do. Postgrowth is what we're going to have to do. That's number one. Number two, Kate Rayworth has done a couple podcasts with me. I don't know when this program will air, but on August 13th, Kate and Steve Keen and John Erickson and Josh Farley have a great roundtable on my podcast talking about the 240 million college students in the world that are taking Econ 101 and how they are being misled about our reality from modern economic theory. And they offer a heterodox economic story that makes more sense. My fear is, I think that's really important. We need to educate young people about what's really going on. But I think the momentum and the power of the system, it almost doesn't matter what's true because things are going in this direction. And we're still going to have to face this post-growth moment. So your listeners and my listeners and people that are rolling up their sleeves and want to play a role in our collective future have to distinguish myth from reality in order to avoid the doors that have brick walls behind them and choose the doors that are still open to us. But I don't think at this stage look at the Prime Minister of England and look at the President of the United States, both very climate aware, are approving new oil and gas leases. I mean, this and you get the head of the United Nations and all kinds of politicians. They can't voice the things that you and I are talking about, Ross, because they would be too threatening to say because there are no easy answers. So I think we have to educate and inform and try to meet the future halfway. All of my work is trying to change the initial conditions of this post-growth moment at national scales, at community scales, and in the hearts and minds of people, because I don't think technology can kick the can for much longer. We could use AI or blockchain or some of these other things to squeeze out a little more productivity in the system in a deleterious way to the natural world, probably. But that just buys us a little more time. I think the next can to kick, and this is kind of a David and Goliath sort of concept, but I think it's true, is in our minds, inner tech, that we don't need all this energy and stuff to be happy. The average person in the United States consumes exosomatically outside of our body 100 times the energy that our physical body needs to survive. The average person in Europe is about 50 or 60 times as much. So we are absolute gluttons in our energy metabolism. We don't need all that to live meaningful, productive lives. We are on this treadmill where we're trying to compare ourselves to the people on the TV commercials that have an extra yacht or apartment or blingy shoes or a handbag, when I would guess if you asked your listeners to reflect on the 5 best times of their life, almost all of them would reflect on times with their loved ones or their dogs or a good meal or a music concert or playing games with a couple of pints of beer. And all these things don't require a lot of energy and materials. So after basic needs are met, which arguably for a lot of humans, they're not, but after basic needs are met, the best things in life are free. But we're caught in this market-led treadmill where more is kind of compulsory and more is not healthier for us as individuals or as society or as a natural world.
Well, I welcome your honesty, and I think I'm just to let you know, I'm very much, a student in all of this. So I think I don't have any particular, I won't be offended or upset by if you rubbish any ideas. But I just think
Well,
there's
just to let you off the hook, we didn't have it. You didn't send me any prep for this, so you had no idea what I was going to say. So to the listeners of Ross's program, this is all on me. He didn't know I was going to say this.
And I like to play
Carry on.
devil's advocate sometimes, because I
Yeah,
think,
please.
there's a lot of very compelling ideas within the sustainability world at the moment, and that's why I wanted to bring up things like net zero carbon, like degrowth, that kind of thing, because I find these very interesting. I don't have the background that you do in the systems thinking of actually understanding the reality of these things. So it is
Well,
good to
just to
get
be
your input
clear,
on it.
I sounded like I was throwing shade on degrowth. Most of my friends, or many of my friends, are in the degrowth movement, and I think it's absolutely essential as an Overton window sort of thing that we
Mm,
start. The degrowth movement is at least helping society envision what a slower, more local, less material intensive, more equal, more respectful of nature world might look like. My
yeah,
only problem with it is we're not going to vote to get there. There's a big old biophysical speed bump between now and there, which I'm trying to focus on. But other
yeah.
than that, I think the degrowth movement does have a lot of good ideas in it, and we should listen to them and continue down those research paths.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, and I think that's a point that I've made in the past about, we're incredibly wasteful with the energy and the materials that we have, and something else I picked up from your podcast is we're not only energy blind, we're minerals and materials blind as well. We don't think about where all the stuff we have comes from. But in previous eras, we have lived happy, fulfilling lives with a tiny fraction of the material and energy inputs that we have right now, and I think I'd like to sort of, as we're getting on sort of the second half of the podcast here, just thinking about focusing in on cities, construction, buildings, that kind of thing. Have you any thoughts on what a great simplification or this sort of course we're on means for communities and cities that we live in? And I appreciate that you're an outsider, which is, I think, is good to get an outsider's perspective on this.
Well, I mean, cities are fully dependent on large scale amounts of energy inputs. All the food, everything comes in through the arteries and veins of global, regional, local supply chains and transportation hubs. All of that requires energy. So one of the implications, some people talk about human population as being a problem. We have 85 million new humans added to the global economy every year that are 7 or 8 pounds each. We have 100 million 3,000 pound vehicles that are added to the global economy every year. So which one of those is really the issue? I don't think major cities are going to be able to afford every person has their own car sort of future in 10 or 20 years from now. Uh, it just won't be viable for many, many reasons. And there are a lot of cities, especially some in Europe. Uh, I don't know about a lot, but I've seen some examples that they don't allow cars in the city center.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, I was just in Copenhagen last year, and people bike everywhere. And it's no big deal. I mean, it's kind of
Yeah.
cool. Those sorts of things. And, electric trains, high speed trains are much more of a thing in Europe than they are in the United States. We're going to have to do more of that, public transport. And I mean, it's just scratching the surface, Ross. We're going to have to rethink a lot of things about our goals, our objectives, how the infrastructure is there, how the grocery stores have things from halfway around the world. I don't know about the UK, but in America, the average meal on someone's table, because of the way food is distributed, traveled 1,400 miles to get there. That is unsustainable with much higher energy costs and a little bit less globalization. I'm not an expert on cities
Sure.
per se, but I think for those architects and city planners listening to this, here's my recommendation. Who is this crazy guy that Ross had on the podcast? He had some things I've never really thought about or considered. Don't take my word for them. Research them over time because it is complex. I've spent 20 years assembling this thesis, but you don't have to agree with what I'm saying. But just imagine that what I'm saying is 10% plausible. A lower growth, more local, kind of post Great Depression future is 10% plausible. Start to do scenario analysis of what that means for your community and what it means for your city, and get people together and just have breakout sessions on, in this scenario, what are the things that we would do? What are the things that we would do? And the mere talking of that about them in a creative, open forum where there's no judgment or blame allows the brain to process these things together with other humans, which then creates solutions that fit that city, like Dublin
Mm,
or Cork or London. The bigger the city, to be honest, the more cognitive dissonance that this story will have. Jared Diamond famously in the book Collapse said that there was a dam that was about to break, and people 3 miles downstream were kind of worried, and people 2 miles downstream were really worried what would happen to their houses if the dam broke. But people living within a mile of the dam were totally unconcerned. And that's because it was so threatening for them that for them to acknowledge that there might be a dam break that would wash their house away would disrupt all the other decisions and behaviors in their daily life. So they suppressed the possibility. So the city of London, people listening to this might be one of those living within a mile of the dam sort of things. This is
mm,
a this is a big pill to take on board, which is why sometimes I wonder if I should even be talking about this because there are no easy answers. What we face is a predicament, not a problem. So there is no solution to what I'm talking about, but there are a million responses And I think we're living at, from a resource standpoint, not from an ecosystem standpoint. From a resource standpoint, we're the richest generation in history. So there are lots of benign outcomes still on the table. But we need, people like you to be open to them and start thinking about them, applying their creativity and problem solutions set to this. And I think we have to embrace uncertainty, and that feels uncomfortable because feeling like, oh, science and technology will solve it, or we're screwed, we're headed for Mad Max. Both of those things obviate any personal discomfort or need for change. So we have to be uncomfortable and think about what this means for your job, for your life, for your family. And I think we are going to come up with responses. But I guess my main message is, what happens if cheap energy is no longer the default path in the next 10 or 20 years? How would we change how your city is organized?
I think that's really good advice. I think when I think back through, I suppose, the history of urbanization, we've been living in cities for 8,000 years. The first city of 1 million people population possibly was ancient Rome, but definitely London in the 19th century. So the idea of a metropolis of 1 million plus people is very recent.
Wait, so the first city in the 19th century in the world to have 1 million people was London?
I've seen conflicting data online, but certainly we know London at that time was the largest city, 1 million people.
Not Shanghai or somewhere like that?
I think they really ramped up through the 20th century.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
I think increasing urbanization, is a trend that we're seeing. We've become a predominantly urban species since
Mm-hmm.
2007. That's predicted to be 70% of the population by 2050. And I think there's this idea in our minds that that's just an ongoing trend that will keep happening. But it seems to me, and a lot of that is the growth of megacities, Lagos, Shanghai, etc. Um, but that's really only possible because we have steel and reinforced concrete that can have this rapid increase of urbanization that is fossil fuel dependent. So what happens when
Yes.
that goes away?
Yes. Well, I could do a pro and a con there. You're right. Steel and concrete require fossil inputs, so we can make alternatives to those, but they're expensive and not scalable as much. So that's an issue. But look at some of the buildings. I was in Spain 2 years ago, and there's things called paradors, which are little wayside places that they turned into hotels. These were buildings that were built 800 years ago and retrofitted a few times, but they still
Yeah.
exist. Most of the fossil fuels that we're burning now are being wasted on just consumption and nothing built for the long term. But the pro and con there, I would say, is yes, we will not have the materials to continue to build, maintain, and scale cities the way that we have now. On the flip side, the cities are where the powerful humans live, and
Mm.
so the political power structures will divert the 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 smaller amount of resources that do exist towards the cities.
Hmm.
So it kind of goes both ways. I live in the country. I'm an hour from a city, but I have chickens and ducks and horses, and I'm trying to live low on the consumption
Yeah.
uh, profile. But I'm blessed. I'm fortunate, and not everyone has that ability. One thing I think is going to happen is we're going to have to replace the things that we are currently getting from financial capital and consumption with human capital and social relationships. We're going to have to be a lot more interconnected with other humans
Mm.
because we've been so rich as a society, especially in cities where you live in an apartment and you turn on Netflix and order a pizza. And you don't have to know the 100 people that live around you, because that's messy. Relationships are messy. They have a lot of ups and downs. But we're going to need other people again in our communities. And I feel pretty strongly about that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that that is possibly something that is almost a preventative measure. Is that community resilience building? Is that thing of, you know, the Dunbar's number, 150 people that you know and trust. I think the people who are in those communities presumably will be much more resilient through the problems we're going to be facing than the sort of rugged individual who's alone in his mansion, you know.
Totally agree. Totally agree with that.
um I think there's a really interesting challenge around what happens to the bits of cities that in a sense are no longer possible to use. I mean, we've with the fossil fuel era of urbanism has meant being able to go out. Everyone has their own vehicle. They can live in the suburbs. You know, that's a very new invention. That's a sort of 20th century idea. Everyone living in a little house or a big house with lots of space, far away from everything. If vehicles and fuel is are, well, maybe don't exist or are very expensive and rare, suddenly, you know, living in the suburbs is like impossible, you know.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Unless there's some calamity, which is always possible, I don't think we're not going to have fuels for a very, very
Mm,
long time. I do think they will be more costly and less
okay.
available, and therefore the social contract and the divide between the haves and the have-nots, especially as it pertains to transportation, will be a huge issue.
Yeah.
So cities, city planners that are able to get people where they want to go with some sort of public transport that's maybe subsidized, that's going to be important. But yeah, I agree with you. The era of people aspiring to have personal cars is probably mostly a thing of the past. We'll have electric cars. I mean, EVs are great. They are not a response to climate change for many reasons we could discuss. But, you know, are cars themselves the answer to a resource and environmentally constrained future? I have a car, but I also have three bikes, and I one of my bikes is electric, and I ride 15 kilometers to the grocery store with a little pack, and I buy my groceries and I come back on my bike.
Yeah.
Now, in the middle of January in Minnesota, I don't know that I do that so much. These are all the things, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, again, Ross, I think you're asking really good questions. I wish I had better answers. I think what we're approaching is an emergent moment in human
Mm,
history, and being aware of it and caring about it affects the emergence. And so I think the best thing we can do is get lots of scientists and activists and planners, in your case, architects and people involved in cities, to do scenario planning and think about
yeah.
this stuff. And it's not going to be easy, but it's certainly not impossible.
Yeah, I think I have possibly a slightly different perspective from you, and I'm being European, living in London. Like, I don't own a car. I cycle, take public transport everywhere, and for me and my sort of, you know, people that I you know, I'm friends with and interact with, that's just like very normal. And there's
Right.
lots of sort of nice, mini, sort of very inspiring things happening within Europe. I mean, there's a city in Spain, Pontevedra, that in 1999 banned cars from its city center.
Well, I mean, at the core of it,
Mm,
if people in London or Europe, unlikely in the United States, at least now, look at Ross and a 28-year-old attractive woman says, I want to live like Ross is. He's walking the talk, he's biking, he's doing these things sustainably. That actually has a huge ripple effect through society on our choices, is what is socially approved and what is
mm,
socially ostracized. And if we're trying to flex with a new Mercedes or a big energy hungry house, that worked 30 or 40 years ago. But I think we need to culturally change what our aspirations are and who is cool. So I just knowing you for 50 minutes, I think you're pretty cool. But if a lot
Thanks,
more
mate.
people look at these sort of behaviors as the right things to do for the
Mm.
planet and for the future, that itself changes the options ahead of us. But if everyone still says, I want the big car and the big house, and those granola crunchy tree huggers are dummies, then it's going to be much harder to change.
I agree with that. I think there's also the sort of there's the architecture of choice of what of our environment as well. Because honestly, in London, owning a car is a pain in the ass because
Hmm.
there's not many parking spaces. It's expensive. To drive to my office in central London, there's nowhere to park there. So like,
Right.
it's basically less. It's a much less hassle not to own one, and that's the case in many cities. If you live in Houston, Texas, or one of these
Yeah.
places that was built fundamentally for the car, you don't get that choice. You have to
No,
own
that's a
one.
really good point. Georgios Kallis made that point on a podcast with me.
Mm,
Some of our infrastructure, existing infrastructure, then precludes our choices. So
yeah.
this is why we need to work on both things at once. And so if you understand the things that I've been alluding to on this call, you can build your city uh, trying to anticipate 10 or 20 years in the future, or you're not building a city, you're retrofitting the
Mm,
city and making changes to it. That those changes then enable people like you to live the way that they want to live. That is more aligned with a lower resource future and aligned with planetary boundaries. So, yeah, you have to do it yourself, and government and city planners have to also contribute. Both of those things have to happen.
maybe to sort of, as we're sort of wrapping up here, I think there's a really interesting thing I've heard you talking about recently, which is this sort of financial side of how we're sort of printing money without any relation to biophysical reality. And I think there's a lot of people in the environmental movement who are sort of calling on governments to say, just invest money in renewables, in refurbing houses to be more energy efficient. All these things that require billions of pounds and dollars of investment towards a green transition, or a green new deal, or that kind of thing. What's the sort of implications of that? I think of just printing money to sort of get these things done.
Yeah, that requires a long answer. Let me do the best I
You've got
can.
10 minutes. Just kidding.
First of all, there is an illusion that efficiency makes us use less resources. This is true on micro issues like air travel or
Mm,
light bulbs. But from a global economy standpoint, we have gotten 1 to 1.2% more energy efficient every single year. But since 1990, we've gotten 36% more efficient as a global economy with respect to energy, yet our energy use has gone up 64%
mm,
because we use the savings and funnel it back into this exponential growing economy. Um, so, doing things uh, for efficiency don't necessarily help, certainly, climate change. But as far as renewables, I think for now, building renewables, it's good for GDP, it's good for jobs, it builds energy that will be available for 20 or 25 years. It's not a bad thing. I just don't think it's the best investment of those billions of pounds.
mm,
I think we need to prepare for a smaller economy and social systems and more localized economy, and those things are more urgent. Um, I think if you have a house, retrofitting it and doing an energy audit, again, this isn't a planetary saving thing, but that will make huge investment payoffs for you and your family in coming decades when energy might be 2 or 3 or 4 times expensive. So you use less energy in your house because it's more efficient. So I think those there's a weird sort of do the right thing locally, but globally it might have a different impact. I do think energy, well, here's the other thing. What I just described was Jevons paradox, which is as we
Okay.
become more efficient, we use more energy. But that's in a growing economy. Once the economy starts to be post growth, that Jevons paradox turns into a Jevons dividend. And as economies are shrinking, more efficiency is an immediate energy savings. So efficiency and technology are going to play a huge role in our future lives in cities, et cetera. It's just right now, from a climate change standpoint, the more efficient we get, the more energy the global economy is consuming, the more emissions, the more environmental damage. It's a weird paradox. But I think all those things make sense. We just have to envision there may be a different sort of economic arrangement with which to apply these responses.
Fantastic, fantastic, Nate. I think I've wrung out as much information from you as I can in 55 minutes. Thank you so much
There's a
for
lot more, Ross.
that. Well, I'll point people towards the Great Simplification podcast and your YouTube channel.
Well, again, I love talking to people like you that are understanding this, connecting the dots, and trying to share the story with others in a pro-social way. It is a complex moment that we've arrived at, and ultimately, it starts with individual change. And I think people listening to this have to consider in their own lives what it would mean to make 30% less money and live a more local existence, not to save the planet, not to save climate change, but to be more personally resilient and personally flexible as things start to get a little bit more crazy. And then you have more options to help and invent and play a role in your cities.
Beautiful. A great note to end on, I think. Thank you so much, Nate.
You're welcome, Ross.